Thank you, President, for your very touching presentation and this movie with the faces of the children that say even more than what words can say. The Princess has graciously agreed to answer some questions. We have a general education. I know that Professor Mchok wants to ask a question still to Stefano Zamani. Do you want to begin since you were the last on the later list, and shall we then go on to other questions? Please, Professor Mchok.
After this very emotional film, it is not so easy to say my point, but it will be also about moral and intellectual courage. Listening to Stefano's presentation, we can ask ourselves, it is utopia, isn't it? How to switch off the mainstream evolution. British politician, philosopher, Colin Crouch, after the financial crisis, wrote 2 books, A Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism and How to Make Capitalism Fit for the Society. But it is not the challenge for politicians. I know Stefano 25 years. I remember it because my first granddaughter was born. He came with a group of Italian economics to Prague when started social and economic transition from communism. And the topic of his conference was what markets can and cannot do. From this moment, I understood that Stefano is a man with great intellectual courage, ready to go against the tide. In 2001, I initiated a honorary doctorate at Charles University for another man with great courage for Joseph Stiglitz. It happened that 4 months after our honorary doctorate, he shared Nobel Prize. 11 years later, I initiated a honorary doctorate for Stefano. I succeeded in spite of the fact that both these persons was ready to swim against the mainstream. And I mean that time is here that Stefano could receive also Nobel Prize. Because everything new starts with strong ideas, strong vision, and with the courage to go against the tide. Thank you very much.
Stefano, do you want to answer? It's embarrassing to answer after such a phrase. Well, Janne.
Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness. This was extremely moving, of course, and for those of us who are mothers, it is very easy to understand how absolutely horrible it is to be a child soldier. And this is, of course, one of the many abuses of children in the world today, where one can manipulate a child more easily than one manipulates a human being, and the dehumanization of the child and the dehumanization of the enemy go hand in hand, so to speak. Once we know from the Bosnian War how the first killing is usually performed on your relative, neighbor, and so on by instruments like a knife, so that you are crossing a natural barrier to killing, and beyond that, it is easier to go on. My question is not about this, but it is more about the inevitable existence of post-war syndrome or traumatic syndromes. How do you deal with that in your projects? Because this we know from grown soldiers, of course, who return to our countries, and it's quite prevalent and it's quite natural. And I would imagine that this is also something you find in child soldiers, although perhaps it is easier for the child to adapt to a new reality, paradoxically it's easier to manipulate, as it is easier to manipulate a child, is perhaps easier to bring the child back to normality. For comments on this, please.
Well, in these cases, the children are victims, but have also been probably assassins. So there are very interesting, useful therapies of speech, to listen to the victim, let the victim, well, just have an ear, really, doesn't it? It's not so important what as they often hold back. But as they are also perpetrators in certain cases, it is very difficult for them to live with us. So it takes very qualified psychologists and people who interfere directly in these transition and reorientation camps. But the same can be said of other children in other situations, not just the child soldier. I thought this was interesting because it's such an extreme case of what we do to children and what they are, and how monstrously unnatural it is, and how we still behave. The Convention of Children's Rights was signed in '79. And we are still discussing these, and they've probably even gone worse. So there are tools, and this is reassessing the child's situation in the world in the context, reorienting in a new context, and reevaluating their skills. They have no other skill than perhaps killing. And that is a very key factor. It's a long, arduous process. Where it's easy with children, I'll grant you that is, and we found this capoeira as a very useful tool, is through play and game therapy, which it exists in pediatric hospitals. There we implement it directly. It is probably much easier than with grown-up soldiers who really suffer from post-traumatic syndrome. But I haven't dealt with that, only with children.
Thank you, Vittorio, and thank you very much, Your Royal Highness, for this presentation and for your presence here with us today. It's an issue in which I have been, as a jurist, involved, particularly in South America, helping to bring about an end to the recruitment of child soldiers in Paraguay specifically. On the basis of that work, I see what is happening today in Syria and in the Middle East with extreme preoccupation, for a couple of reasons specifically, which I would love to have your insight about. One is that, notwithstanding the fact that in Sierra Leone, after the conflict, child soldiers were given a very explicitly separate and differential treatment from other demobilized combatants, that is not the case, at least under the current paradigm in the Syrian conflict. And some child soldiers are continuing to be held criminally responsible for their actions afterwards, rather than being treated as victims. In part because international law, as I'm sure you know, although it prohibits states from recruiting child soldiers, it does not immunize those soldiers afterwards from criminal liability, which is just a terrible paradox in my view. And so part of the question is, what are the prospects in Syria for creating a system similar to that of Sierra Leone, where we might be able to treat the child soldiers once demobilized differently? The second preoccupation about the Syrian conflict, which is so different from my experience in South America, is the ideological dimension. The extent to which the children are being brainwashed with ideologies of corrupted religious views of violence to my view, seems to make it quite different in terms of the exigencies of the system. The children are, from the start, being told that if they go back and kill their own parents, they will attain paradise. And that religious dimension of it, I wonder what that requires in terms of demobilization and reintegration that goes even beyond the prior experiences that we've had in the African and South American contexts. Thank you.
Well, I think it is essential to develop what we call these transition and reorientation centers. because it is our only known solution right now with adequate personnel to treat and look after these children. We have children from age 6, so it's very complicated, 6 to 18 or more. So the approach of the problem is totally different with a 6-year-old than with a young man. And also a lot of girls. I think in Syria there are fewer girls, so it's also different. As one always would like to speak of prevention as a long-term solution. In the case of Syria, it is an unknown question. Of course, the implication of civil society would be fundamental and vital. And when I mentioned rethinking our education methods and our outlook towards education, involving the community in schools and in educating facilities. Parents who are completely separate, have no idea what their children are being taught or learning, or have no interest. I think the community, civil society, has to be narrowly connected to any form of schooling or education, and especially in the future, when we have access to, for instance, these Syrian children. It is, I think, essential in their reconstruction.
Thank you. Your Highness has raised a question which is relevant, I think, for both presentations, which is the issue of trust. How to build trust, either in broken institutional contexts or in fragmented social contexts, because that's also a relevant question for the civil economy. So I would like to hear your experience on the ground, how to build personal trust, but also Stefano's answer to the problem. Yeah, thank you.
To rebuild trust, or to focus on trust, it is, I think, a teamwork. It cannot just be a psychologist or pediatrician or child psychologist or any other intervenant in these emergency situations. You have to enlarge that circle to whatever remaining family or responsible grown-ups who will serve as a role. You have to have as many people involved in that process of transmission of trust. It cannot, I don't believe from my experience and with the professionals who work on that it is on a one-to-one basis thing. It is incomplete otherwise. You have to enlarge trust until it can become a representation of what society could really be, or really is, for the child to rebuild himself. And of course, putting the individual back in the center of the discussion, not always referring to a group of, whether it's a tragic situation, but putting a face and of an individual, be it a child or not.
Stefano, since Anna Marta addressed you too, do you want to say something about trust?
No, Anna Marta raised a fundamental issue. I always found very interesting to go to the original root of the word trust, which comes from Latin fides. And in Latin, fides means rope, was the rope, linking one person to another. That is why important, because trust, it's basically a relational good, just because it's a rope. So in situations like those described by the princess, where institutional trust has been destroyed, what remains is personal trust, because it is obvious. So that is why the strategy bottom-up is fundamental. You need to re-establish the ropes or the cords, according to among people, because that is the prerequisite to achieve the institutional trust. The other aspect is, do we trust those who are trustworthy, or can we trust people even though at the beginning they are not trustworthy? This is a big issue among social scientists. Because if we trust only those who are trustworthy, it is obvious. That is almost a tautology. If you are trustworthy, I have to. The real challenge is when you are not trustworthy, the question is, how can I trust you? That is the reason why, at the beginning, the primum movens of a trust relations is a relations of gift. I have to make a gift because I have to trust even though you're not trustworthy.
I only want to inform the princess that our great effort with the Academy was to suggest the revision of the Sustainable Development Goals in August, just before the approbation with the travel of the Pope, and we obtained a new target, 8.7, to say, take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst form of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labor in all its forms. Maybe today all the countries have a new moral imperative. At the moment, we not arrived to declare that this is a crime against humanity, as is the formulation of the popes, but we try to arrive to this. Thank you.
Thank you. It was one of Ahmad's objectives, as far as over 15 years ago, to have crimes against children declared crimes against humanity. And we have a lot of documents on that. It was never accepted, with, as well as I mentioned earlier, the notion of pedicide, which could be brought to the International Court, the Penal International Court. But hopefully, with these new resolutions, we will achieve that goal. Thank you.
Since I do not see anyone asking a question, I abuse my privilege as chair and ask also a question to you, Royal Highness. You certainly know that one of the greatest texts ever written about child soldiers is by a former child soldier, namely Grimmelshausen, Simplicius Simplicissimus. Grimmelshausen is a 17th century German author who as a child was abducted and had to fight. We don't know exactly when he began to fight, but he was probably a teenager, if he was a teenager, perhaps only 12. And he has written the greatest novel of the 17th century, which describes an idyllic, Edenic life in a village, and suddenly violence breaks in. Of course, people are raped, the house is burned, and he is dragged away as a child soldier. And Grimmelshausen is the most prolific author of the German 17th century. In fact, he published a lot of works under very different names, and people found out who the author was only in the 19th century, because he was at the same time narrating the horrors that he had endured and did not want to publish it under his own name. During his lifetime, only one person knew who had written the greatest masterpiece of German literature. And my question, based on Grimmelshausen's Simplicius Simplicissimus, is, you spoke about speech therapy. How important is it for the children to reenact, as painful as it is, all what they have gone through? It seems to me that there can be no solution in simply wiping it away. That's not the way how our mind functions. You spoke about the scars on the body, but of course the scars in the wound are even more complex because they're not visible. And is there any attempt to try to help these children by reflecting, expressing the horrors they have endured? Obviously, it cannot be forced upon them, but Grimmelshausen's work is a fascinating example of someone dealing with it and becoming then, in his way, as far as it's possible, a relatively balanced human being.
Well, it's interesting. There's been a lot of improvement and progress because a lot of studying has been devoted to this this question, not only in the case of child soldiers, but of any victim of various crimes or injustices in the way the mind and the trauma can affect the individual. Now, they don't necessarily need to speak out or to relive or reenact, because I said every individual has a different way with coping with these problems. So that is up to the therapist to determine, so one-on-one, of course, conversations, just so they know, the child in question will know that someone is there to listen. And of course, as they live in a group, a large group, you saw there are hundreds of these children, there are little workshops with 5 or 6 individuals who are told they can share their experience. Now, some talk out and will speak. I was there with them, and they will go into minute detail of various horror and everything. Others will stay mute or hardly give any idea of what they've been through. As I said, it's a long, arduous process. You have to be very patient. And that is where trust also within this little group, and then the group in large, these children and young men who are in the transition and reorientation centers form, just to know someone is there to listen to you, someone has lived the same thing, more or less. Whether some wish to share it or not, and of course then the therapist has to balance that as she decides or estimates is the best. We've made tremendous progress there, but what is sad is that we can send men into space, but we still have made no progress on mental health. Very little comparatively, and I find that preoccupying, and we are trying to deal with the tools we have.
Your Excellency, please.
Your Royal Highness, you also mentioned the children in the street. When I was in Brazil 30 years ago, it was very often mentioned that in the larger cities you have these groups of children totally abandoned to themselves, with no families, which were organized among themselves, perpetrated all sorts of criminality, and were treated by the police in a way. They were shooted at in sometimes. If that continues, I don't know. But my question is, do you also monitor this kind of, this category of abandoned children?
Absolutely. We have, that was our first, one of our first goals and missions. So we collect children from the street and put them in houses in small groups, never more than 15 or 20 children per house, with what we call a house father and a house mother. And according to age groups, so the older ones are not mixed. Of course, if you have a family, then we will set up that family, brothers and sisters, in one home with different family units. It is tedious. We cannot deal with so many cases, but there are a lot of, we've developed a sort of model that we pass on to other NGOs who duplicate it then. So whether it be in the Philippines, Cambodia, we've worked, well, of course, in South America, with Casa do Menor in Brazil, in Kinshasa. In Burundi, it was more specific to the civil war, well, of course, the Tutsi-Hutu massacre, and where we dealt with over the years more than over 4,000 orphans. We didn't know where they exactly came from, and to put them into homes, rebuild them, and then what we call communitarial prise en charge, involving the community to take in these children. But it's a long process. It takes several years.
Louis Sabourin.
Thank you very much, Your Highness. I'd like to ask you a very specific question concerning what I would call the reactions of others. And first of all, as you are working in many parts of the world, you have to cope with many entities, national and international. So what is the general reaction of those vis-a-vis your work? And do you get the cooperation, especially of the countries where you have to operate? I'm thinking now about what's happening in Nigeria, for instance.
Cooperation in the country would be in certain places non-existent, I'm afraid to say. Even if we do get to reach or have contact with various members of government concerning education, youth, or health. These people, these governments change on a very frequent basis, so it is very, very difficult, nearly impossible to maintain a constructive contact with any given person in government. That, I have to say, is rather frustrating. On the other hand, since Ahmad has existed now for quite some years, and we have a consultative role at the UN, we have developed really an important and very fertile network with other NGOs, other associations, within even the local civil society. In Congo, the government is not participating at all in any of our actions, but local Congolese NGOs are instrumental in helping us coordinate our actions and pointing us where the problems are the most urgent. So it's a daily balance, and it changes according to countries.
Since nobody raises their hand, may I ask you another question? It's the problem of impunity. Obviously, it would be naive to assume that by punishing the criminals who recruit these children, you can abolish the harm done to these children. But the justification of punishment is always that in the future you may diminish crimes of that sort. How do you see the development of impunity with regard to the child recruiters? As far as I know, the impunity is rampant. It's extraordinarily high. Do you see any progress in the last decades in reducing impunity for those who recruit these kids?
I'm afraid I have mixed feelings on punishment, and perhaps the most successful revolutions in my lifetime were led by Mandela, Gandhi, and King, and they were all non-anger and non-violent. So I think we have to focus, and especially in dealing with reconstruction of shattered personalities, we have no time to dwell on retribution, or which involves forcibly humiliation on one of the two parts. I think we are in an urgency to move on. That was, I would like to say, beyond forgiveness, and to where the notion of trust is so important. And I think for a lot of these children, especially in these developing countries, these three models I just cited are a very strong message of non-anger and non-violence, and how much you can achieve through that.
Let me ask again, I do absolutely not deny that the task of your organization is to work with the children, but do you not think that the trust is partly, the trust that we have, for example, in our societies, is partly based on the functioning of the legal system, that we trust certain things do not occur because there are sanctions backing those who violate it. And even if this is not the task, again, of your organization, don't you think that it is important for the international community to build up a legal system of sanctions that brings perpetrators to justice? I agree with you, it's not the first task, but it's, in my eyes, quite a legitimate task.
Oh, absolutely. It is essential that we have a legal arsenal to be able to not so much punish the crime, but if you're going to rebuild trust in these children, in this lost generation, it is inseparable from justice and truth. So crimes have to be exposed, and there has to be a form of justice, but a reasonable, thought out. It's a very challenging process.
Yeah. Any other question? Well, we thank you very, very much for your presentation, not only because of the insight that we have gained on this issue, but because we felt that what you are doing is inspired by moral principles, and ultimately the last source of trust is that we feel that the persons with whom we interact are not self-interest maximizing machines, but that they are themselves inspired by moral trust. And insofar, your presence is a factor that helps building up trust. Thank you for your work.